I would say that prayer before I preach so that God will guide the words of my mouth, but as a backup, even if I mess that up, then what you get from it will be whatever you need. So. The central question for any Christian is, who was Jesus? Who is Jesus? And that was a question for those who followed him when he was alive. It was a central question for those who followed him in the early days and years after he was killed. And it remains a central question, I think, for us today. Some saw him in the category of a prophet, in the traditions of the prophets of old, in the tradition of John the Baptist in some way, as someone who called for justice in the face of oppression, who sided with God for the poor and the powerless, who were held down by the rich and the ruling classes. A prophet called to be a beacon to God's chosen people, to live even now in the reality of God's kingdom in defiance of the Roman Empire. Some saw him as a teacher of wisdom, as a specialized position, a mystical teacher, a teacher of mystical wisdom, of spiritual gnosis, so-called knowledge, spiritual knowledge. Saint Luke pretty much portrays him as a man of power, as a wonder worker and healer, miraculously born to inaugurate the age of the Spirit, the age of miracles. St. Paul most often speaks of him as the Son of God, who is offered by God in this sacrifice, a sacrifice meant to atone for humanity's debt, which Paul had come to believe could not be repaid in any other way, so that the flow of grace was opened through this sacrifice, and a flow that came not only to the Jews but to the Gentiles, also in an environment that Paul thought was the end of days, was the time was short. Others who experienced that same environment, that same sense of the end of time, proclaimed that Jesus was the expected Messiah, the son of David. Matthew, who is Jewish, is grounded in that tradition, uses that most often, and sees the coming of Jesus as announcing the kingdom, with himself as the new king. Now, all those views had different histories. All those views brought maybe a pattern through which people could read and understand Jesus' life. They're all kind of different, and the church worked to mix them up and discover their commonalities. Some traditions went away from the church, some disappeared or failed in their ability to get across that teaching. The church certainly draws on St. Paul and St. Luke on the Gospels, St. Matthew. Probably, I think, the most common understanding of Jesus in the church begins with his acclamation as the Messiah. Peter says, "You are the Messiah. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." In its Greek translation of Christos, Messiah almost becomes Jesus' last name, Jesus Christ, right? Calling ourselves Christians means, I think, that that makes the same point. That we really need to look at this. We can't really understand what the church is teaching us about Jesus, who he was, who he is, nor can begin to shape what that might mean for us today in our society without understanding this concept of Messiah. We can't just mouth these words. As if it was Jesus' last name. It means the anointed one. Christos means anointing. It was part of the coronation ceremony. But we need to look at how this began, how it developed, what it meant then, what it might mean now. It was influenced by other traditions along the way. It's been applied in different ways. But it's at the heart, I think, of trying to draw from the tradition we've inherited a meaning that we can then take to the world that we've been given. Not an easy task or calling. The Messiah represented the hope for blessing, the hope for renewal. It was a calling back to a time that was seen as a kind of golden age. David and his son Solomon had extended the kingly power of God's people, of the kingdom of Israel, to its furthest extent and its maximum influence. It was kind of an accident. The great empires of that area, Egypt along the Nile, the Assyria, Babylon, other empires that were part of that whole Tigris-Euphrates Valley complex, Persia to the east, all at this certain time, probably around 900 BC, were having internal strife and internal problems. And they pulled their militaries back to guard the homeland, which allowed David and Solomon to triumph with their military and their might. And they did very well. They conquered Jerusalem, made it the capital. Solomon built the temple there. It became a focus for worship as well as political power. But it didn't last really long, maybe 80 years. Egypt and Babylon and those places got their act together. And pretty soon, the kingdoms divided first, and then the whole northern kingdom of Israel with its 10 tribes got conquered and diffused through the population of the Assyrian Empire. Judah paid tribute and got off the hook at that point, but later Babylon conquered Jerusalem and destroyed the temple, destroyed the palace, took all the leadership, the royalty, the teachers, the priests, everybody of influence into exile in Babylon. So people identified salvation with a new king, like David. And that was the birth of the hope for the Messiah. And it went both ways. They were hoping the Messiah would bring that new greatness, but then also became a religious hope as well. You can't separate the secular and the religious much at this time in Judaism. But decade after decade, century after century, there was a kind of disappointment. Each new king was acclaimed as potential Messiah and then couldn't do it. Things fell apart and they were powerless. They were conquered by one empire after another. But still, even when they were in exile in Babylon, they were hopeful. And they still believed that God was working through this what you could call secular power, but kingly power, and that a Messiah would come. What happened in Babylon was an expansion of this hope to where the coming Messiah was didn't necessarily have to be a new Jewish king, but they identified the Persian Emperor Cyrus, who was not of the lineage of David, but nevertheless was a king, who came and conquered Babylon, allowed the people to go back to Jerusalem. They called him the Messiah and felt that God was acting now on a larger stage, but it was still this same political stage in a sense. When they went back to Jerusalem with great hope and rebuilt the temple, still the power didn't return. They still had to pay tribute to the Persians, to the Greeks, to the Romans, whatever. And so their hope began to transform. Rather than putting so much faith in the coming of a new political king, a new military force, they came to believe that God would act from beyond history and come or send the Messiah to save them from heaven. This was an important reframing because before any other religious thinking among all these empires and among history, the Jews were the most grounded in history. Everybody else sought their religious meaning and their spiritual energy from what we would call today mythology, a kind of non-historical understanding of the powers of the world and how they influence things. And the religions were aimed at appropriating that power, trying to assuage that power. But spirituality was not in the realm of the historical. Until about this time of the exile. This is where it gets tricky. Right at the time when the Jews were shifting this hope for the Messiah, this hope for salvation from history and the military conquest to a more spiritual, more heavenly realm, the other empires of the world were going the other direction. At the same time that Isaiah, or at least one of his successors, who was writing in Babylon, at that same time, the Buddha was teaching in India. Confucius and Lao Tzu were teaching in China. Zoroaster, who started Zoroastrianism, was teaching in Persia. And the earliest Greek philosophers were starting to think non-mythologically in Greece. It's a time that was known as the Axial Age, because I think the world had gotten too complex to deal with mythologically. And so there were interpretations of things, reinterpretations, efforts to understand the mythology more metaphorically. The Greeks developed philosophy. Buddha developed, in a sense, what is a kind of psychological analysis. Confucius set up a structure for society that would be ordered, much more grounded in history, in society, and leaving behind an appreciation of myth. While the Jews who had been historical had based their relationship with God on what God did with them in their journey through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, through Moses and David, they began to look, in a sense, to myth. And that empowered, that brought a spiritual power and opened up possibilities that were not limited in the way that their governmental, their political, their moral, their legalistic rules had dictated. Well, so what we are, what that time marks is a boundary land. It's a boundary land between a reality that is appropriated and experienced through non-logical, non-rational, non-objective ways. And it's moving from that to what we recognize a little more as the way that we think about things, objectively, rationally, problem solving. The trouble is that kind of thinking distances you from anything that you could consider spirit, distances you from the kind of invisibilities, the mysteries of life. And we try to pack everything into some neatly understood box. The Messiah can't be just another commodity we're hoping will come to fix things. The Messiah can't be like a new technology or a medical device or some new way of efficiency. The Messiah carries this power that takes us beyond the world we live in. And that was true back then, that's true now. The Advent idea takes shape in this borderline, this borderland, this wilderness. And we are very far away from that in our society. It was a hard sell for 5th century, 6th century Judaism, but our culture is just nailed to objectivity. When we use the word myth, and I could have tried to define that for 10 minutes, we use it like a lie. We say, well, that's just a myth. But really, mythological thinking for the human species has been the way to access religious truth forever. And if we get ourselves totally cut off of that and think only of the facts, only of materialism, we'll never discover, we won't discover the truth, and we'll look for salvation in places like kings or people who pretend to be kings, or in military might, or in money and pleasure. We'll not even understand that there is a realm of spirit, that there is a place to go to out in the wilderness, out by the river, to meet God in a different way. Each of us, I think, has that same borderland within ourselves between time and eternity, between history and myth. And Advent is calling us, I think, along with John the Baptist, calling us out to just be there and be patient and wait to look and see and discover who is coming. Thanks be to God.